All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound pleasure to welcome you to lesson one of this year's newest JLI course entitled Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. We're going to be spending 4 weeks, just a heads up. In many years past, JLI has been a 6-week ordeal. This course is only 4 weeks long. We are going to be spending the next 4 weeks talking about anti-Semitism. 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 You know, ever since there have been a Jewish people, we can be absolutely assured of two realities that are absolutely guaranteed to exist in this world. And those two realities are anti-Semitism and jokes about anti-Semitism. I would be remiss if I did not start our conversation this evening with one of my personal favorites. In 1881, Tsar Alexander of Russia was assassinated. It was, their equivalent of Lincoln. It's horrible. And the next day, Moshe, the Jew, was walking in the marketplace of Moscow. And one of his business associates stops him in the marketplace and says, "I'm sure you heard the Tsar was assassinated." Moshe says, "Yes, I heard the Tsar was assassinated. Undoubtedly, they will probably blame this on the Jews and the milkmen." And his friend looks back at him and says, "The milkmen? Why would they blame the milkmen?" And Moshe looks back at him and says, "Why would they blame the Jews?" What we're going to be talking about, the direction we're going to be taking this conversation over the next 4 weeks, and I think it was very, very aptly described in the marketing, and it's on the front of your course book, is we're going to be discussing anti-Semitism as something which is absurd. You'll notice the marketing for this class has been on the absurdity of anti-Semitism, how to beat it with purpose, positivity, and pride. If anti-Semitism was something which we believed was, let's just say, a matter of substance, we would discuss it in one fashion. And being that we're going to take the position that anti-Semitism is something, a bit of an absurdity, we're going to focus on beating it with purpose, positivity, and pride. Be that as it may, as much as we talk about anti-Semitism from an absurdity perspective, the reality is that in the world that we live in today, a conversation about anti-Semitism is not merely a study of history, but actually a commentary on somewhat current events. Statistically, I may come from a different generation than most of you in this room, maybe all of you in this room, but I think that what we all have in common, regardless of the year or the place of our birth, is that throughout the 20th century, for most Jews living in the Western part of the world, living in the diaspora, anti-Semitism was an issue which we dealt with almost at an arm's length. Obviously, there were the atrocities of the Holocaust, and then we had the Jews who were stuck behind the Iron Curtain, the former Soviet Union, and we had the Jews that were living in Israel that were subjected to everything that was going on in the Middle East at that time, the various wars through the back half of the 20th century. However, over the past 2 decades, surprise, surprise, anti-Semitism is no longer something that we in the West, that we in the diaspora, that we in the blessed United States of America are now watching from afar or participating in some sort of social commentary. Anti-Semitism has arrived on our doorstep. Before we focus on the conversation as it pertains to us being here at home in the United States of America, I want to begin by drawing your attention to figure 1.1 in your book on page number 3. In 2019, a group called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism posed 2 questions to the Jews of Britain. London, England, nice people, right? Give them their fish and their chips and they'll be fine, they'll be good to go. Pretty chill population for the most part. I spent 3 years in England in yeshiva. I relatively enjoyed myself. I can't say I was chased up and down the streets of Golders Green by rabid anti-Semites. I don't think the anti-Semitism that took place in England in the early 2010s when I was in rabbinical school was particularly noteworthy. Well, in 2019, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism gathered together British Jewry and they asked them to verify their opinion on 2 separate statements. In the past 2 years, I have considered leaving Britain. Friends, not Pakistan, not Germany, Britain. Britain, due to anti-Semitism. Well, the results somewhat speak for themselves. 11% of the people strongly agreed, 31% agreed, which, as you see in the chart below the little pie graph, is an extreme growth year over year. They then further asked them, due to anti-Semitism, I try not to show visible signs of my Judaism when I go out, like a Star of David or a Jewish skull cap, a kippah. And again, you see the numbers, you see the trends. You know, I digress for a moment. When I was younger, we had always heard my mother's first cousin is the Chabad Rebbetzin in Istanbul, Turkey. Right? You think Utah's a tough posting. They got Turkey. And we had always heard that her husband, the chief rabbi of Turkey, the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Turkey, I should add, is able to live in Istanbul, and they have a synagogue, and then everything is nice and hunky and dory. But to this day, when he walks in the streets of Istanbul to services on Shabbat or to go about his business, he always wears a ball cap. He will never go out with a kippah. We had heard about this going on probably 20 years at this point. Okay, that's Turkey. Turkey is a Muslim country. Turkey finds itself in a pretty tricky geopolitical area. You want to tell me the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Turkey doesn't feel comfortable walking in the streets of Istanbul with a kippah? I hear you. Istanbul ain't in London. And yet, Jews in England in 2019 gave their approach as to how they feel anti-Semitism is growing, metastasizing out of control in England. Now, we don't just have to talk about England to kind of get a sense of where things are headed around the world. Let's talk about things right here at home. Today is Monday, October 25th. In 2 days, it'll be October 27th. Does anybody know what happened on October 27th? On October 27th, 3 years ago, I was standing right by that colonnade that you see right over there in the lobby. And this man sitting right over there wearing the green plaid shirt and cool glasses walked in on a Shabbat morning and let me know that a gunman had opened fire at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, killing 11 people in what is now known to be the worst anti-Semitic attack on American soil in history. 6 months later to the day, 6 months later to the day, on April 27th of 2019, a gunman walked into Chabad of Poway, California, and opened fire, killed 1, injured 3. We don't want to talk about Jews in England and Jews in Istanbul and Jews in Kumwat. We're talking about Jews in Pennsylvania. We're talking about Jews in California. On Sunday, May 18th, 2021, 5 months ago, 5 months ago, I walked through those doors in Salt Lake City, Utah. For crying out loud, Salt Lake City, Utah, and found a swastika etched onto the door of the synagogue. Now, we can talk about from today till tomorrow why it happened and how it happened, where it happened, when it happened, but it happened. But it happened, and it continues, sadly, to happen. I draw your attention to figure 1.3 in your book on page number 5. For those of you that are here in person, you can see this up there on the big board, the Anti-Defamation League. Our friends at the ADL will be sharing some information from them throughout the coming weeks, tabulated the amount of what they clarify as anti-Semitic incidents from the years 2013 through 2019. And my friends, I have some pretty sad news to share with you. That arrow is headed in one pretty specific direction. You can look further on in the book at figure 1.4 and figure 1.5, talking about events in Australia and in Canada. And frankly, if we wanted to throw a pity party for ourselves, we could go all night. Yes, I could spend the entire first class and most of the second, third, and fourth talking about how rampant and out of control anti-Semitism is. That is not what we're going to be doing, as you probably well expected when you signed up for this class. We're going to kind of acknowledge the elephant in the room right from the outset. It's bad. It's concerning. It is. These are the numbers. We can't really escape from these things. This is hard, cold data. And yet we're not going to lose ourselves in this sort of information. That's not why we have all gathered here this evening. I don't think that's the reason that any of you wanted to participate in this sort of discussion. You see, researchers have actually gone on the record and shared that I'm going to apologize to the folks who are watching on Zoom. I do tend to pivot as I stand, and I'm realizing that if I go this way, which for some reason seems to be where I'm going out of camera. I'm working on this, I promise. I see the problem and I'm working on it. I'm going to try to go this way. Researchers have shown that for too long and too deep, Jewish expression has gotten too tied in with anti-Semitism. Researchers have shown that Jews have gotten too bogged down by anti-Semitism, and here I would add, they have tied their Jewish identity too profoundly to anti-Semitism. There's an incredibly bright woman. Her name is Deborah Lipstadt. You can see her full bio on page number 9 in your book. She's written extensively on the topic. We're going to be sharing some texts from her, but before we share some of her thoughts on the matter of anti-Semitism, and she is somebody who is definitely qualified to speak on the topic. I'm sorry, there's a question that's come in on the chat. Oh, thank you, Lana. Doing great. Thank you. My friends on Zoom, if you have questions or thoughts, please feel free to chat. We'd like to include you in the conversation. There was a study conducted in 2020 by our good friends at Pew. They definitely seem to be right at least twice a day. They're definitely something around the broken clock status, but they share interesting data. If you take a look on page number 8, figure 1.6, the percentage of Jews who say that blank is an essential part of what being Jewish means to them. What is the most important part of being a Jew? Is it eating matzah balls? Is it protesting? Is it fetching about your back? What is the most important part of being Jewish? 76% of respondents said the most important part, the most essential part of being Jewish for them is remembering the Holocaust. Some of you may be aware there was an op-ed today in the Deseret News by the governor, and the governor and Seth Brisk. Seth Brisk is Laura's going to help me. I'm going to botch his title. Seth Brisk is the South Pacific Regional Director of the ADL. They wrote an op-ed about the swastika that had been formed out of syringes by the protest that took place at the governor's mansion 2 weeks ago at this point or something. And both the governor and Seth Brisk made the argument that you're welcome to protest vaccine mandates until you're blue in the face. Don't use swastikas. I lost family in the Holocaust. My blood boils when light is made of the Holocaust, when references are made of the Holocaust, when the word Nazi or Hitler is thrown around in our parlance and in our conversation in today's day and age like a political football. Yet, I will also say at the same time that for me as a Jew, remembering the Holocaust is not the most important part of my being a Jew. There are dozens of other factors to my Judaism that are more important to me than just remembering the Holocaust. I hope every member of humanity remembers the Holocaust. 76% of American Jews say the most important part of being Jewish to them is remembering the Holocaust. What does that say about the state of American Jewry, about the focus of American Jewry? Well, let's find out. Michael, please read for us text 1A on page number 9. Aloud, if you don't mind, so the nice people on Zoom can hear you as well.
Repeat that, please.
Text number 1A. Go ahead, read it in English on page number 9.
Most Jews will immediately step forward when Jews anywhere are being attacked by anti-Semites. This is, of course, as it should be. What is regrettable, however, is that for some Jews, the fight against anti-Semitism becomes the sum total of their Jewish identity. Recently, a much respected Jewish communal leader lamented to me that he regretted not having educated his children about Jewish traditions and culture. He was, however, very proud of the fact that he had embedded within them a total intolerance of anti-Semitism. His kids were prepared to be at the barricades to do battle against this hatred and many others as well. His comments made me sad. Anti-Semitism has become the drummer to which his family's Jewish identity marches. They know of Jews as object, not subject. In other words, what is done to Jews becomes far more significant than what Jews do. This well-intentioned Jewish father had deprived his children of a rich and multifaceted legacy. They've been taught to see themselves mainly as perennial victims, besieged for the oppressor, control over one's destiny. It leaves many Jews, including Hispanic children, aware of what to be against, but not to what to be for.
To put it in the words of Deborah Lipstadt, what is done to Jews becomes far more significant than what Jews do. Deborah Lipstadt is a PhD. She's a researcher. She's written at great length So her words are a little bit more at great length. I think the best sentence that really sums up the issue here belongs to that of Barry Weiss, the former editor of the New York Times, on the editorial page, who at the No Fear, No Hate rally in January of 2020 put it into the following words. Susan, read for us text 1b on page 10.
The Jewish people were not put on earth to be anti-Semites. We were put on earth to be Jews.
Anti-Semites. It feels like that sometimes. It feels like the burden of being a Jew is to be an anti-Semite. I've thought about this a lot recently. I talked about the fact that tomorrow on the non-Jewish calendar will mark 2 years since the Pittsburgh shooting. The Pittsburgh shooting took place on a Saturday morning. About 48 hours later, we had a vigil here in Chabad. Many of you were there. It took place right behind me in the lobby, and it spilled out into the parking lot. There were 600 people on premises, and a lot of the wider community came out into the parking lot and formed a circle of love around the building. It was tremendously powerful. One of the most incredible nights that I remember in my time in Salt Lake City. You know what struck me as so powerful? There were Jews at this vigil who we see usually only on the high holidays. You see them 3 days a year in services. Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. They added a 4th day that year. They made an exception for the vigil. We actually saw Jews that we don't even see on the high holidays. The Jews that don't even come out on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We saw those Jews too at the vigil. Now that's beautiful, but it's also a little confusing. Is that what Judaism has become to some people? Participating in vigils against anti-Semitism? It's important to have these vigils. It's important to go on the record and let our community share that shooting up a synagogue in Pittsburgh is something which our entire state, bar none, protests against. But what to make of our identity? Has Judaism, the sum total of Judaism, becoming an anti-Semite? You know, there's a Jewish woman here in town. She follows me on social media. She has become my monitor. When somebody in Utah says something inappropriate or tweets something inappropriate or thinks something inappropriate, she lets me know. Texts me. I have to say, she's quick. She knows things before most of the general public knows things. I don't know where she gets this information. So sadly, we've been texting quite a bit recently. Oh, this one tweeted this. Oh, this one said that. And I appreciate it. It's good to know these things. So recently I texted, I said, you know, I'm teaching this class on anti-Semitism. You seem very bothered by anti-Semitism. Why don't you come to the class? No. I don't come to classes. For some people, the sum total of Judaism is monitoring social media and making sure that anybody who tweets anything about anti-Semitism, the rabbi will know, will issue a strongly worded condemnation in the world. For some people, we've become more focused on what is done to the Jews than worrying about what the Jews themselves do. For some people, the Jewish people, being a member of the Jewish people has been about being an anti-Semite. And that's not why we're here. That's not what it means to be a Jew, or is it? We'll find out over the next 4 weeks. In a very general sense, here's a to-do list of things that we're going to hopefully accomplish over the next 4 weeks, and I would urge you to hold me to this. If you feel that these questions are not answered in a satisfactory fashion at the end of these 4 weeks, please let me know. But here's what we're going to try and figure out. What are some tools for coping with fears triggered by anti-Semitism? What role does faith play in addressing anti-Semitism? What are the best strategies to reduce anti-Semitism? What are the root causes of anti-Semitism, and how does identifying these factors impact our efforts to prevent the hatred? How can we counter Israel-focused anti-Semitism? And how can we determine when criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic? How can we forestall well-meaning Jewish youth from unwittingly lending their voices to anti-Semitic agendas? What is the best strategy for dealing with a public figure who takes an unfavorable position toward us? Yes, Laura.
On a personal level, I think this is a great summation. I'd like to add an 8th
Please.
line to this. How do we deal with some of our Jewish friends that are the worst anti-Semites out there?
I think it's a very good question. I think that number 6 will hopefully touch on that. We talked about forestalling well-meaning Jewish youth from unwittingly lending their voices to anti-Semitic agendas. I don't know if there's a Jew, there might be a few. I don't know if there's a Jew who intentionally intends to be anti-Semitic. I think a lot of anti-Semitism that comes from within is somehow covered over in other garments. And this is not meant to be anti-Semitic, it's meant to be something else. And so I think a lot of the unintentional anti-Semitism that comes from within will really be covered in that discussion. And again, hold me to the fire. If it's not, you let me know. Fair? Fair.
I would
Ilan.
just like to remove the word unwitting.
Okay, fair enough. I think we're being optimistic. Yes, Ilan.
So I just have a question. I mean, you asking the question on why do you think that remembering the Holocaust is 76% of what people think that is what it means to be Jew. And I would like to just put on the table that Jews do not live in isolation of the general society, and the general society past 5 years, maybe 6 years, has been to basically, the more victim you are, the better you are in that hierarchy of victimhood.
I agree.
And so I would suggest that for most Jews who think that this is the best, that is their way to claim victim.
I would agree with you. And furthermore, if it's any consolation to you, I think Deborah Lipstadt agrees with you. If you look back at text 1A that Michael read when we began, I'm holding about 5 lines from the bottom, they have been taught to see themselves mainly as perennial victims. So if we are looking for a race to be the most oppressed people, we win. We win big time.
That's right.
Right.
So the argument is like, well, that's our
Right, and fair enough. And I think the point of the class is, can we share with people that there is something more valuable in being Jewish, or something more valuable than just worrying and obsessing over anti-Semitism? Let me make one thing clear. This is something which I cannot argue with. If you want, at the end of this class, to fret nonstop about anti-Semitism, I can't move you off that position. If you are looking for ways to not get there, if you intend not to be there, if you don't want to fret, hopefully this course will give you the tools to not fret. But if you are someone who wants to remain in oppression mode, I mean, you've come to the right place.
And if I make just
Please.
a quick remark, one is a joke that I think you would appreciate.
I love jokes.
I don't know, I mean, maybe this one in English, but I heard it in French, which is in a class, the teacher asked every kid to write about elephants, and everybody writes about elephant, and little Moshe write about elephant and the Jewish problem. And that's exactly what you're saying. It's like everything is actually kind of
Seen through that
seen
lens.
through that lens.
Absolutely.
And then to address your issue about anti-Semitism from Jews, I've had this discussion that I found extremely depressing from when arguing about the BLM movement and arguing about clearly anti-Semitic movement. And a Jew came to me, a Jewish parent came to me and said, please do not say this privately. Please do not say this because you are destroying an alliance between Black and Jews. And so we should just be very, very nice and just do not mention that they are anti-Semitic because it would ricochet against us.
I hear you.
And so I think a lot of people that are kind of anti-Semitic is because they don't have the courage to see beyond kind of
Fair enough.
alliance.
Fair enough. We're going to move on. We're going to participate in an exercise together. Everybody, here we go. My friends on Zoom, you're welcome to join us. There's a lot of couples on Zoom, so feel free to do it with the person who you're sitting next to. Page 12. Have you or anyone close to you recently been the victim of a verbal or physical anti-Semitic assault? Just let's get a raise your hand if the answer is yes. Come on, my friends. Really? Nobody else? Folks on Zoom? No? Jacob, there we go. Okay. Okay, if the answer is no, consider a recent anti-Semitic incident that you heard about. Well, we all live in pretty close proximity to the door with the swastika. What were your immediate feelings after the incident? Anybody? Let's go. We're going to limit these answers to one word. Fury. Anybody else?
Sadness.
Sadness. Friends on Zoom, feel free to chat at us. Anybody else?
Fight or flight.
Fools. Jacob? Jacob, yeah, just chat.
Fight or flight.
The audio is coming through shaky.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to talk.
Thank you. Fools, sadness, fury.
Kick him back.
I like how you morph three words into one word. Very well done, Doug. Fight or flight. Okay. Outrage. What were some actions that you or others around you took as a result of the incident? Anybody take action? Anybody? Yes, Laura.
I'm in direct communication with our congressmen and senators, and I make certain that they are aware.
Fair enough.
of every action.
Anybody else? We had a police car parked in the parking lot for 6 weeks. I think everyone at that point knew it was just kind of sitting there. There was nobody in it, but it was a well-intended gesture. Jacob? Jacob, the audio is really choppy. If you don't mind just chatting at us, that would be appreciated. Okay. Sadly, for a lot of people, and when we talk about the emotion, oh, I'm sorry, there's a few things come over here. Jacob says calling out the ideas underlying the insult, then reviewed his self-defense options, all good answers. With the intensity and the quantity of anti-Semitic incidents that have been happening recently, the reality is many of us have become fearful. We worry quite a bit. And the reality of unconstructive worry as it pertains to any sort of issue, be it anti-Semitism or taxes or the fact that your mother doesn't like you anymore or anything of the sort, unconstructive worry, obviously, we all acknowledge from an intellectual standpoint is not the right way to go about approaching any issue. Why? Unconstructive worry, A, makes us incapable of responding towards anything, and B, makes us view anything in our path as a potential threat. So we don't want to worry in an unconstructed fashion. I've convinced you that worrying in an unconstructed fashion is not the right way to go about things. The first part of tonight's class, I'm going to, I guess in a certain sense, talk you off the ledge. If you take a look at page 13, in the context of anti-Semitism, what might be some means of avoiding unhealthy panic? This will really kind of be the conversation that we're going to start tonight with. I have spent 20 minutes spooking you and freaking you out and telling you how bad anti-Semitism is. Now I would like to make you not panic unnecessarily. What are some steps that we can take to avoiding unnecessary panic? We're going to discuss this in 3 prongs. And the 3 prongs are called the miraculous people, consider the full picture, and I fear not because you are with me. 3 possible thought processes that might help you not to panic, not to worry unnecessarily about the perils of anti-Semitism. If 1 works for you, great. If 2 work for you, great. If 3 work for you, great. And if none of them work for you, we'll keep on talking. Let's begin with text number 3 on page number 14. Counselor, please, Rick.
The fact that we're here is such a historical anomaly, it makes no sense. So sometimes when I'm asked about anti-Semitism, people will say, well, how can you be optimistic? How can you see the positive in such a dreary situation? And I say, because we shouldn't be here. The fact that we are here shouldn't be taken.
We've been through a lot as a people, tremendous amount as a people. And yet, it's 2021, showing you the charts. We're here, we are in Salt Lake City, Utah. We've gathered freely. We have endured a lot as a nation, and we are still here. In 1168, the Jews of Yemen found themselves in a very, very difficult situation. In fact, they found themselves in the epitome of between a rock and a hard place. They found themselves cornered by 3 separate issues, controversies, or scandals that were all breaking all at once. In 1168, a new cleric became the ruler of Yemen, and he decided to put forced conversion upon the Jewish people living in Yemen. Either they were to convert to Islam or they would receive a very, very harsh punishment. If this were not enough of an issue unto itself, there was a Jew who did convert to Islam and began to preach to his brethren and sisters that Islam was not just not contrary to Judaism, but Islam was actually the reincarnation of Judaism. The best thing that a Jew could do would be to convert to Islam. At the same time, turns out we cannot keep all of our nut jobs on some sort of rotation. Some of them all tend to go off at once. At the same time, there was also an imposter Messiah who argued with his colleague who believed in apostate persuasion and said, no, he was the real Messiah, and he was encouraging the Jewish people to do something else altogether. So the Jews of Yemen were really striking out. I mean, 1, 2, and 3, different communities have dealt with one of these issues at a time. In 1168 in Yemen, they really hit the trifecta. The chief rabbi of Yemen wrote a letter to the leading Jewish sage at the time, someone who you may be familiar with from JLI, who was the chief Jewish sage in 1168. Anybody? It was the Rambam, it was Maimonides. And Maimonides wrote a lengthy response called Igeres Taimon, the epistle to Yemen. And he wrote to the sage at great length how he should be thinking about this issue. Let's read this together on text 4 on page number 50. God assured our father Jacob early on that although the nations would enslave his descendants, treat them cruelly and subjugate them, his children would survive and endure, whereas those who enslaved them would eventually disappear. God told him, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. Although they are destined to be trampled and downtrodden, as everyone tramples the dust of the earth, they will overcome and triumph in the end, just as, to continue the analogy, the dust eventually rises over those who trampled upon it when their corpses are buried. So Israel will remain in existence, whether those who have trodden upon her will not. The Creator similarly assured us through his prophets that we will never be destroyed, that he will never permit our annihilation, and that we will never stray from being a nation devoted to its purpose. Just as it is impossible for God's own existence to be nullified, so is it impossible that we should be destroyed and eliminated from the world. So spoke the prophet Malachi, I am God and I have not changed, and you, the children of Jacob, have not been destroyed. When you encounter somebody who has a problem, a very, very grave problem, and they come to you for your support or solutions or whatever it is, it's never wise to tell them it's all going to be okay, because they might perceive that as dismissive. In effect, it's ultimately what the Rambam, what Maimonides told the Jews of Yemen. It's all going to be okay. And this was 1,000 years ago. We have been here for a very, very long time, and we will continue to be here for a very, very long time. We will be trodden on like the dust of the earth, just as the dust of the earth ultimately rises over those who trod upon it. We will ultimately prevail over our enemies. This is 1168 in Yemen, and think about how the Rambam's words ring true throughout the centuries that have followed. From inquisitions to pogroms to Holocaust to local anti-Semitism, it's important to point out that the reason that we are a nation and still a nation with everything intact as we are is something miraculous. And so on a very basic level, if anti-Semitism leads us to the place of concern that maybe this is it for us, maybe we are actually up against it and we will not come out the other side, it's important to bear in mind that our people have faced far worse and far greater, and yet, to put the Rambam's words into a very, very succinct description, here we still are. This is prong number 1. Prong number 2 is called consider the full picture. I have shared with you the statistics from the ADL, which was in figure, I believe it was 1.3, that anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise. I am now here to share with you the good news, my friends, and that is that although anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise, anti-Semitic attitudes are rapidly in decline. To be more specific, according to the Anti-Defamation League, although there is a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, there is a decline in anti-Semites that makes any sense. There are less people doing more things. The ADL puts out this study where they put together a number of what we would call, what's been very often referred to now we see in the media as anti-Semitic tropes. A number of anti-Semitic tropes, and asked the general population how many of them believe in 6 of these or more. Take a look at figure 1.8. It's like everything which they ever could have said about the Jewish people before you on a beautiful sheet of paper. We stick together more than other Americans. We like to be at the head of things. We're more loyal to Israel. Too much power in the business world. I'm frankly disappointed they did not put on this list my most favorite anti-Semitic attitude. We control the weather, just a basic, it's one of my all-time favorites. So in 2019, they asked people how many respondents believe in 6 of these stupidities. Well, good news. Take a look at figure 1.9. Only 11% of people that responded to this study put out by the ADL believed in 6 or more of these attitudes, which actually is the lowest on record since they had begun conducting the study in 1964. A lot of the bases for anti-Semitism, we'll talk more about this next week, the stupidities that perpetuate a lot of these problems, but people believe less in the attitudes that cause anti-Semitism. So to put it in the terminology of this class, although anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise, good news, and I actually believe this not just to be kind of like give you a cherry on top to make you feel better, but I believe this to be something comforting as a whole. Anti-Semitic attitudes continue to decline. Remind me your first name again, sir. Your first name. Yes. No, next to you. Yes. Aviv, thank you. Read verse text 5, please, on page 20.
It is heartening that attitudes toward Jews have improved over the last few years, and historically have been significant. Said Abraham H. Fulton, ADL National Director. On the occasion of Centennial, it causes us to take a broader perspective to appreciate how far we have come in 100 years. In 1930, there were no surveys like this, but anti-Semitism was rife in public and private expression in universities, jobs, and neighborhoods. In 1964, when we did our first survey, we found that 29% of Americans held anti-Semitic views. So we and America have made new progress.
So you can, and these are numbers, these are data points. You can like them, you can dislike them, you can hate them, you can love them, you can agree with them, you can disagree with them. But I think it's an interesting piece of information to consider. Also, when speaking about historically the anti-Semitism that our people have endured for generations, for centuries and millennia, our people have endured anti-Semitism at the hands of the ruling class. Talk about 1168 in Yemen, just as a small example, talking about forced conversions and pogroms and mass killings. Thankfully, by and large, Jews live around the world today in areas where that is not an issue they have to contend with. That doesn't mean there aren't people in power who have anti-Semitic views, but the world over, Jewish people live in environments where, by and large, almost exclusively, they have the opportunity to practice their religion freely. The amount of freedom that a Jew has in 2021 to live literally in every corner of the world as an openly defined Jew, I would make the argument, is as high as it has been in human history. And so again, whilst we do talk about rising anti-Semitic incidents, morons who carve swastikas on the doors of synagogues, when we speak about how society views an issue, thankfully there's reason to believe that those attitudes are on the decline. Yes, Laura.
Does the ADL or any other organization dig into this further to determine why this is now happening? That
I did not actually read this information from the ADL. I prepared the class as you see the information. And so it's likely they do. The ADL usually is a pretty thorough bunch. And I'm sure they have data points on precisely why that is. A lot of the conversation around why anti-Semitism will be next week. And so I haven't gone through the whole thing for next week. I'd be curious if we touch on that next week. But this is kind of the information in its skeleton fashion. The third point of our three-pronged approach. I fear not because you are with me. I feel like, my friends, I feel like this is not the right way to quote the verse. Everyone knows where that expression comes from? Where's it from, my friends? Psalms 23, but when we talk about it in English, it would be more accurate of, I fear not because thou art with me. I feel like you are with me, like has cheapened the legitimacy of the expression. I feel when we talk about Psalms 23 in English, it needs to be because thou art with me. But on that note, what is the most often repeated two-word phrase in the entire Tanakh, in the entire Old Testament? Old Testament, 24 books, two words that appear the most, two of them. Do I have any takers for two words that appear the most often in the entire Tanakh, all 24 books of the Tanakh? Nope. Two words, side by side. Nope. The two words are al tira, do not fear. The words al tira side by side appear in the Bible 44 times. If you include the plural, it's 70 times. If you include tense variations, it becomes 110 times. Every historical Jewish figure in the Bible at some point or another was told, al tira, do not fear. Abraham was told, al tira. Isaac was told, don't fear. Jacob was told, don't fear. Moses was told, don't fear. Anybody want to guess what Joshua was told? Yes, he was also told not to fear. The Jewish people are told not to fear. Let's actually read Psalm 23 in its most original version. Elon, text 6, page 21.
In the original, is more than.
No, in English, please. You don't.
A song of, when you said the original.
I meant from the book. You're right.
A song of David. God is my shepherd, I shall not lack. He allows me to lay down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Even if I walk in the valley of death shadows, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they're comfort.
I want to very quickly make two profound points from Psalm 23. Does anybody notice the repeated shepherd references? Well, beyond the Lord is my shepherd, but we talk about green pastures, we talk about the rod and the staff. Does anybody know why the shepherd inferences are so powerful? David was a shepherd before he became king. In fact, it was because David was a shepherd that God decided that he would become the monarch and that would remain with his descendants forever, because a lot of the qualities that David expressed as a shepherd, God found to be ideal in the Jewish leader, in the monarch, the way he cared for every individual sheep. There's another very powerful point from Psalm 23 that I want to draw your attention to. Even if I walk in the valley of death's shadow, I will fear no evil. You know what David doesn't say in Psalm 23? Everything is hunky-dory. David does not say, I believe in God and therefore I've got no problems, I've got no worries, everything is fine, everything is fantastic, life's good. No. David acknowledges, Gam ki elech begates almaves, though I walk in the valley of death's shadow, I have reason to fear. I don't, because you are with me. It's an interesting attitude on life. David's not saying, hey, I've got a God on my side. We're good. No. I will walk in the valley of death's shadow. And notwithstanding that, I will not fear, for you are with me. I'm not going to make you all come in here tonight and say, outsmarting anti-Semitism. Come on, there's no such thing as anti-Semitism. It's a figment of somebody's imagination. We're good. We're good, everybody. We're just jolly. God's on our side. He's our shepherd and our something else and our rod and our staff. No, it's real. There are real concerns out there. There is real reason to fear. And notwithstanding all of those valid reasons, I will not fear, for you are with me.
In January 1948, in the dark hours of the Soviet Union, a child was born in Stalino. who was destined to symbolize mighty struggles. A bitter global struggle between the bald eagle and the brown bear in the throes of their Cold War. A one-sided struggle between terrifying tyranny and human rights, between brutally enforced atheism and the free soul of the believer, between monstrous anti-Semitism and a proud Jew, and between the temptation to collapse and the superhuman will to survive. Nathan Sharansky graduated from Moscow's Physical Technical Institute before joining the underground human rights movement, reclaiming his Jewish heritage and emerging as a foremost dissident and spokesman for human rights. In 1973, Nathan took the calculated risk of applying for an exit visa to Israel. He was denied and rose to the forefront of Jewish refusement activities.
Well, I was in the middle of the struggle and the station was very dangerous. Some of my friends were arrested when new wave of repressions against Jewish activists was prepared. And at this time, I received a note from my wife through some and together with this note, a small song, Later writes that this song was with me the last year when I was trying to go to different places to go. And they have a feeling that the time has come to send you. They open the book and they can't read it because I never learned how to read these texts. And also, most of the girls they don't, many of them they know about 1,000 girls and our daily struggle, prison, repressions, demonstrations, but not these girls. So inside I don't have time for these small things, but I'm very busy now in organizing demonstrations and press conferences. And
in 1977, he was arrested on false charges of spying for the United States. But prior to the announcement of his verdict, he famously declared, "To the court, I have nothing to say. To my wife and the Jewish people, I say, next year in Jerusalem." Sentenced to 13 years in prison, he spent the next 16 months some 1,600 miles away from Jerusalem in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, often in solitary confinement and in a special torture cell before being transferred to a Siberian labor camp.
They bring me the list of things that they confiscated, and there is mentioned this small black book, not in Russian, and I understand that they're talking about this song which was sent to me every time, and then they remember this song, and they demand that they'll give it to me. And it was a long struggle. 3 years after I was arrested, they returned the book to me together with the telegram for my mother that my father passed away. And it's of course it's difficult to, it's always difficult, but when you cannot be with your family. And they decided that the only thing which I can do, I will be reading this song until I understand. And so I'm reading these hundreds of thousands of words where I cannot understand whether the sentence begins and ends. I can't understand more than a couple of words. And then simply comparing to different places of this world, I try to find out the connection. And it so happened that the first phrase from all these hundreds of thousands of words, short phrase, certain very short words, which ends up full of the end of the phrase. Gamo ti elech magate tomalat bo yara yata. It's from the Psalm Count Gimel, and when it goes with the valley of shadow of death, you fear no evil because you are. And that was very powerful. It was very good for me. And some they were taken from me. I was fighting and on hunger strikes, refusing to work, sometimes refusing to eat and to bring it to the bed.
He resisted and persisted with remarkable courage. His miracle dawned in 1986 when he was released in a prisoner exchange. Leading Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Shimon Peres, welcomed him to Jerusalem.
And even when they already took me from prison, the place all my clothes, I was lying in the snow, refusing to go to the airplane without getting this book back, because I found all my scratches there. So that was the only piece of property which I took from prison, and all the years it's always with me. That gives me a lot of time.
The Hebrew phrases in Sharansky's Petite Black Book were authored 28 centuries earlier by King David, who reigned from the splendid city of which Sharansky dreamed, Jerusalem. It was he who crafted the powerful line of prophetic poetry that blent indestructible hope and undefeatable strength to endless generations of Jews in distress. Even if I must tread through a valley forged by death's own shadow, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. A fountain of eternal confidence generated on behalf of each Jew in every century in the face of the mightiest and most monstrous obstacles. You are not alone. God is with you. Walk with confidence. The creator of the universe stands guard at your side.
Just want to comment. Do you love how every time Sharansky mentions the word, he says Psalms? To him, it's an English word. To in Russian and Hebrew, the word means nothing to him. They told him in the video to say the word Psalms, so they showed it to him in written forms every single time. Natan Sharansky told the story, he always says Psalms. For me, it's always just kind of, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. To him, it's his limited English, and it was always going to be Psalms. I want to wrap up this part of the class by referencing text 9 on page 23, also from Sharansky's favorite book, Psalms. V'haboteach b'Hashem chesed yisayvevenu. Those who trust in God will be surrounded by benevolence. In fact, God tells us that the more that we trust in God, the more we bring about for ourselves the ability to be surrounded by benevolence. A few moments ago, I asked you a series of questions. I asked you if you had been the victim of anti-Semitic incident, or can you think of somebody that has, how did it make you feel? And what actions did it inspire as a result of that thought process? So at this point, I hope I've convinced you that being able to use faith in one's arsenal of not fearing because you, with a capital Y, you are with me, should be a good motivator to not cower in the face of anti-Semitism. So how should we feel in light of anti-Semitism? We should trust in God. What actions does that then inspire? Well, earlier we asked what were some of the actions that you or others around you took as a result of the incident. Trusting in God. What actions does trusting in God lead us to? Someone who has faith, someone who lives with faith. What do they do with their faith? Let's take a look at exercise 1.2 on page 24. Using the words God and human action, craft a sentence that best expresses your impression of Judaism's vision for the divine/mortal interplay on matters like security. If you were someone who believed in God and you were concerned about your security, feeling secure in the face of anti-Semitism, what would you do? I know you'd have faith. Once you have the faith, what would you then do? Anybody want to offer? They tell the story, I think in the 1960s, things were very, very, very rough in Israel. The economy was out of control. Inflation was all over the place. immigrants were flooding in from all over. And so Israel was really trying to figure out what to do facing an existential threat. And so in the Knesset one day, one of the ministers gets up and says, guys, I have the most amazing idea. You know what we should do? We should go to war with the United States. We should bomb the Statue of Liberty. He said, why? Why would we go to war with the United States? So the minister says it's very simple. Historically, if we go to war with the United States will absolutely wipe the floors with us. And what does the United States do with a nation once they've wiped the floors with it? They come in and rebuild it. So they're going to come in and they're going to give us a whole bunch of money and they'll rebuild our economy and everything will be good. We should go to war with the United States. So one guy in the back of the room raises his hand and says, I have one question. What happens if we win? So if we live with trust, what do we do? What do we do as a result of that trust? To really enter this discussion, we'll put the questions up on the big board. To really put the questions up on the big board, we're going to look at this issue from a very, very interesting perspective. We're going to look at this issue from the lens of the greatest anti-Semitic threat in the history of the Jewish people. What was the greatest anti-Semitic threat in the history of the Jewish people? We have been around for 5,782 years. And 5,782 years of tyrants and dictators and altogether not nice people. Who was the greatest threat? Sorry, Rick, you're laughing. What's the answer? No, I think you know the answer. What's the answer? Anybody? Ahasuerus, very good. Haman. There was one time in history the Jewish people were threatened with absolute extinction. Throughout each class this course, spoiler alert, we're going to be reading different texts from Megillas Esther, from the book of Esther. Just by way of introduction, in the beginning of the book of Esther, it says that King Ahasuerus ruled from Hodu until Cush. That was the expanse of his region. Anybody know where Hodu and Cush were? Historically, they were side by side. The point of saying that Ahasuerus ruled from Hodu until Cush effectively meant that he was the ruler of the entire developed world at that time. So in effect, when Ahasuerus put in plan a system where the Jews in his entire kingdom would be exterminated, that meant a death sentence for every single Jew on the face of the earth that existed at that moment in time. The greatest anti-Semitic threat in the history of our people. We're going to learn a lot from the story of Purim over the next couple of weeks. Tonight, we're going to focus on a seemingly boring part of the story. It's not the threat and it's not the victory. It's a very, very interesting conversation, which takes place in chapter 4, of the Megillah. So the threat is out there. Esther is notified about the threat by Mordechai. And Mordechai tells Esther there's this threat, an existential threat against the Jewish people. You need to go and tell the king. You need to go and plead for your life. This is why you're in the palace, Esther. Now we figured it out. Now we know why Vashti is dead and you're installed instead. This is why. Go talk to the king. Esther, as it were, has a number of stipulations that she wants to put into place. Those stipulations defy rationale. Lorraine, read for us text 10, page 25. Go ahead.
Esther dictated a message to be sent back to Mordecai. Go and assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan, with them fast on my behalf, for them neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my maidens will fast likewise, and then I shall go to the king, although it is contrary to the law. And if I am to perish, I shall perish.
Continue. I think it goes on to the next page. Continue on 26. Does it not go on, Mordechai?
Mordecai went ahead and implemented all that Esther had commanded him. On the 3rd day, Esther donned her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace.
Okay. So it's the worst threat of anti-Semitism in the history of our people, an existential threat. Good news. Good news. I can imagine Mordechai sits down at the big board meeting. Good news, everybody. I have good news. We literally have our man, woman, on the inside. The queen is Jewish. This is awesome. Why was Esther the queen? Let's not pull punches over here. Why was Esther the queen? Because Ahasuerus was a horrible man who was inspired by his worst impulses. And he was a man who appreciated physical beauty more than anything else in the entire world. And Esther was the most appealing virgin who showed up at the beauty pageant. This is why Esther was the queen. If Esther was to somehow impress the importance of her needs on Achashverosh, what would be a key factor over here? Charm, beauty. You know what Esther should have said to Mordechai? I will go and speak to the king. You will put together a GoFundMe, which will pay for a spa day and a quick shopping trip to Neiman Marcus, and then I will go and speak to the king, all glamoured up. I'll look great, which is the only reason why he likes me, and then I will go and speak to the king. No, Esther goes to the king, or Esther agrees to go to the king, only after doing what first? Fasting for 3 days, 3 nights. Imagine for a moment at the end of Yom Kippur service, right? You fasted for 25 hours. You look, like they say in English, like a shmata. Yeah, it's the end of Yom Kippur, and someone shows up outside the synagogue and says, oh, hey, Charlie, your date is here. Now, I'm going to go home, have a bagel, take a shower, change my clothes. 3 Yom Kippurs. At the end of 3 Yom Kippurs, then Esther is going to go and seek favor in the eyes of the king. Esther is caught between 2 realities. Either you trust in God, which would be the reason you'd want to fast, and Esther says to Mordechai, hey, Mordechai, no problem. Hey, no problem. We're going to fast, we're going to pray, we're going to give charity, we're going to say Psalms, chapter 23, we'll all do it together, we'll walk in the valley of the shadow of death, it's all good, and then things will sort themselves out. I don't know, Haman will slip on a rock and bang his head, and Achashverosh will have a change of heart. It will sort itself out. Or, on the other extreme, Esther should have said, yeah, I'll do this. I will go lobby the king. I'll get all glamoured up and I'll go talk to the king. Esther somehow chooses a middle path, which doesn't work with either one. She believes that she needs to go and talk to the king, so she doesn't dump it all on God's plate, but yet first she fasts for 3 days and 3 nights. Explains Jewish mysticism that the mentality that Esther was plugged into is something which we can all deeply relate to. Historically, we know that when our forefathers were in the desert, God provided for them. God provided for them to a very, very specific extent. Anything and everything which they needed was literally delivered onto their doorstep by the Almighty God. Manna fell from the heavens, not in the proverbial sense, but manna actually fell from the heavens. God cared for them and provided for them in a way you cannot even begin to imagine. Nowadays, manna doesn't fall from the heavens. Nowadays, if we want to eat and we want our families to eat, we need to provide for them. Many of us might think that nowadays, the nature of our relationship with God is that we are meant to create. God gives us raw materials, and we take those raw materials, and we are meant to create with those raw materials. God gives us intellect. God gives us powerful abilities, and we utilize all of those different faculties to create. Explains Jewish mysticism, it could not be further from the truth. This is a common misconception. The way God provided for the Jewish people in the desert was miraculous. The way God provides for us now is somehow a partnership. Explains Jewish mysticism. Even currently, our earnings are gifted from God. But God wants us to live in a paradox where everything comes from God. God creates a world of concealment, and we are meant to carry on that concealment. To put this in simpler terms, there's a famous expression out there. God helps those who help themselves. You may be familiar with this term. Jewish mysticism teaches us that actually it's a little bit different than that. God helps those who create an appearance that they are helping themselves. Meaning, we do not live in the desert nowadays. Manna does not fall from the heaven nowadays. You know who put that system in place? The same person who made the manna, the same being that made the manna fall from the heavens. And God has tweaked the system now just a little bit. God gives us the same things he gave us back in the desert, but God also wants us to put in place a system that we should be able to convince ourselves that we are engaged in some sort of partnership with the Almighty. God wants us to live in a world where we create the concealment that it is our work that somehow brings about the blessings that God showers upon us. But really, God cares for us and God provides for us just as much as he did when manna rained down from the heavens. God helps those who make it appear as though they are helping themselves. So, in biblical times, if you were hungry, what did you do? You went to your doorstep and God provided you food to eat. In 2021, if you are hungry, what do? Well, God also provides you food to eat. But here's what God wants you to do. God wants you to get a job. God wants you to get a job so that you can live in an intentional world of concealment, where a paradox is in place that it's only because of your hard work and only because of your success that you will be able to provide for your family. When in reality, it comes from God the same way as the manna from the heavens. I want to talk about this now within the context of anti-Semitism. After the Pittsburgh shooting, obviously, we were all very, very much on edge, as one can well imagine. And as people tend to do, specifically Jews tend to do, we talked about it, and talked about what we should do, what we should do, what we should do. In the meantime, after 6 months of talking about what happened 6 months after the Pittsburgh shooting was the next synagogue shooting. And after the California synagogue shooting, we decided the time for conversation had concluded and it was time to do something. Miraculously, 2-3 days after the Poway shooting, we got an email completely out of the blue here at Chabad. There was an ex-Marine who had just finished his deployment. Rick remembers Calvin fondly, who had just come back to town, and he was volunteering to stand outside Chabad on a regular basis every Shabbat morning, armed and at the ready to provide security for the community in light of the uptick in synagogue shootings around the country. Obviously, it was a touching gesture. A young 23-year-old guy was going to spend his Saturday morning standing outside the synagogue with his weapon on his hip, caring for us and keeping us safe and secure. And he did that for about 6 months, and then I think, kind of the good gesture kind of wore off, and he went off and did other things, and we've put other systems in place. What I'm about to say, I don't mean at all to be somehow disrespectful or not appreciative to the generosity of spirit that Calvin, our volunteer security man, showed on that day. But let's be frank for a moment. Suppose somebody showed up to Chabad with really, really, really bad intentions. With really bad intentions. Game out that situation 100 times. How many times would Calvin have been effective? Half of them? At best. I mean, we're talking about somebody who has no backup, who has 2 years of Marine training, who has a handgun on his hip. To say that all of us inside the synagogue absolutely felt secure because Calvin was outside and Calvin will save us. It was a nice gesture. We definitely felt more secure. But to say having Calvin outside was a guarantee that nothing would happen to us ever again, that might be a bit of a stretch. Ultimately, what did we rely on after the Pittsburgh shooting and the Poway shooting just as much as we had relied on it before both of those shootings? We rely on our faith. Now, we live in a world where if we're going to have faith, God wants us to express that faith in a very, very particular fashion. If you have faith, create a concealment for me to work in. Create a space that you might see Calvin standing outside the synagogue and say, okay, guys, now we're safe. Calvin's here to save us. It's God that we trust in. Calvin helps us feel a little bit more secure because Calvin is the concealment. Calvin is us making it appear as if we are helping ourselves. I will never forget, after the swastika incident, the media was all over it, and a reporter from Channel 13 came interviewed, the usual questions about anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah. She asks me a question. She says, Rabbi, what steps can your community take to make sure that something like this would never happen again? I said, we can close the center. If we close Chabad, no one will ever want to do it again. Take steps to make sure it will never happen again. Come on, let's be real with one another here. We put up cameras and alarms, and SLCPD parked the car. We can't guarantee that this will never happen again. There is nothing that a mortal flesh and blood can do to make sure that guarantee this will never. Call the National Guard, you can't guarantee it will never happen again. Ultimately, what does it boil down to? It boils down to faith. But the funny thing about faith, the paradoxical thing about faith, is that God will only allow faith to work if we make it appear as if we've got this figured out. So think about this for a second. Does God want us to put up security cameras? Yes. Does God want Calvin to stand outside the synagogue with a gun? Yes. Does God want us to move the service into the outside parking lot and say, we don't care about anti-Semitism? No. No. God has created a system in which we are meant to make it appear as though we are helping ourselves, whilst always remaining mindful of the true reality of what we have to remember. Let's read text 11 together, one of the seminal texts, the basis for this idea taken from the work of Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe on page 28. Everything that comes into being in this material world must materialize through natural means. Nature, however, is simply a garment, meaning God's energy bringing things into existence must be dressed, concealed, and obscured, to the point that an observer sees only a world that appears to run naturally. In truth, however, everything emerges directly from God himself. He obscures the divine bestowals until the miraculous and supernatural reality of material existence is not observable, and material developments is perfectly natural. When, for example, God provides an individual with an ample livelihood, it is not done through a miracle as it was in the Sinai desert, when God rained manna and meat from the skies. Rather, God sends the blessing through the individual's business affairs. The gains reaped through commerce appear so natural that the individual can be fooled into thinking along the lines of, it is my strength that generated this wealth, and it is my wisdom that led to success. For I am well versed in commerce, I know what to buy and the most prudent times to sell. This arrangement works as long as we prepare a valid garment through which the divine flow of sustenance can descend into material reality. Our occupation must be proportionate, so that according to the rules of nature, the sum required for our livelihood could theoretically be gained via such an occupation. If this requirement is met, our occupation serves as a perfect garment in which God can disguise his blessing. For we could easily claim I acquired this wealth through my own skills. Because it is indeed considered natural for such an occupation to yield that range of profit. Since such an assertion is logically sound, our occupation is an appropriate conduit for God's kindness. Accordingly, while we work, we should be mindful of our belief that our earnings are God's blessing. They are like any other open miracle, like the miracle of the man. Our actions merely weave a garment behind which God can disguise his blessing. One should apply the same concept to all other areas of life. Pursue your needs in accordance with your understanding, with the intention of forging an appropriate garment through which God will send his blessing. God will then act as he sees fit, providing the truest form of good that is appropriate for you. God intends for us to have a miraculous partnership. We create space for God's protection, but then more importantly, we secure God's protection. A synagogue should have two things on its front door, a lock and a mezuzah. It is these two ends of this miraculous partnership. It is remembering that we are meant to make as if we have got this under control, which is why we have locks, and we're actually encouraged to use those locks. Lock the doors at night. But also remember that at its core, it's about remembering who is backing up this partnership, who is the second half of this equation, which is why we have the mezuzah. God specifically wants us to walk this double reality. And I think some tzedek provides a fascinating analogy. If you want to have 100 grand a year, work in a job that would allow you to make 100 grand a year. Don't get a position which is paying you 50 grand a year and say, oh, the other 50 I'll find in my backyard under the tree. No, get a job. Find the right garment that obscures the blessing to a certain point that you can feel like you are doing it on your own. And always be mindful of where the blessing truly comes from. In fact, explained to the sages, this is why Esther, and specifically Esther, demonstrated this concept, embodied this idea, specifically when viewed in the narrative of the wider Purim story. Again, there's another obscure detail in the beginning of the Megillah, in the beginning of the Purim story. The Megillah begins with a discussion about a party. Achashverosh threw a party, a very lavish party, a party that according to tradition lasted 180 days. And the Megillah goes on and on and on and on about this party. Why is that important? That he threw a party, how long it was, how lavish it was, who came to the party, what they ate, what they drank, who cares? Explain the commentators, because that's where the whole Purim story really begins. Achashverosh threw a party. Think about this. We're talking about the tail end of the Jewish biblical age of the Old Testament times. And there's a party. The king is making a party. Who has he invited to his party? The Jews. The Jews are eating at the royal table. The Jews are invited to the king's party. You know what happened when they got to the king's party? There was food. There was a lot of non-kosher food. And Jews showed up to the king's party and there was non-kosher food. Thought to themselves, this could be sticky. What am I going to do? Turn down the food? I'm at the king's party. Turn down the food. I'm here to make a good impression. I'm here to show what a good constituent I am, what a good subject I am of the king. I can't turn down the food. And so historically, we're taught that a great number of very devout Jews at that party ate treif. Think about this. Think about the miraculous partnership. Who keeps the Jews in Shushan safe? Achashverosh or God? God. Does God want the Jewish people to turn down a royal invite and say, Achashverosh, we don't need you. Keep your party. We're not coming. We're not concerned about your favor. No, God wants us to be on good terms with royalty. But where does the line in the sand get drawn? When an allegiance has to be formed with either Achashverosh or God. That's when the proof is in the pudding. There's having a good relationship with the monarchy for the sake of looking out for our own best interests. Good. That's good. That's the miraculous partnership. But when do we cross that line in the sand? When we attend the feast and we eat treif. And it was specifically Esther who had to rectify that in the story. Esther didn't say to Mordechai, no problem, let's pray. We'll pray till we're blue in the face, and when we're blue in the face, God will help, and the decree will be turned over, and disaster will be averted, and we will all live happily ever after. No, Esther said, okay, we've got to conceal the blessing. I will go to the king. But what am I going to do before I go to the king? I'm going to fast for 3 days. Fasting for 3 days might leave you looking not very desirable in the eyes of the king. That's fine. It leaves me looking desirable in the eyes of God. And ultimately, that's what matters. And so explains Jewish mysticism. What this boils down to is, where is the primary focus? Both the Jews who attended the feast and Esther believed in working through conventional methods. They both believed in being on the king's good side. What it boils down to is, can being on the king's good side also put me on God's good side? Jews who attended the feast decided to err on the side of the king, and Esther decided to err on the side of God. And that's why disaster was averted.
And that's why.
Disaster was averted. That's why the decree was overturned. Because Esther remembered the roles in this miraculous partnership.
But when she does that, and when she has everyone fast, that sends quite a message of trust in God, and how she works. So it's revealing, not concealing.
One could make the argument that Achashverosh wasn't mindful. It's important to realize the dynamics of the kingdom back in the day. We're talking about a queen who hadn't had a face-to-face interaction with her husband in over 30 days, which is why seeking his counsel, having a conversation with him was so dangerous. The level of interaction in Esther's daily affairs on the part of her husband was minimal if it existed at all. So the notion that Achashverosh would have been aware of the fact that Esther had covertly decreed the Jewish people should fast for 3 days would be questionable at best. And I make the point further. Achashverosh doesn't know that the decree comes from Esther because in his mind, he doesn't know Esther is Jewish. So the key point is not the Jewish people fasting. They could fast from today till next year. The point is Esther fasting. Because Esther was the one who had to go lobby the king in an impoverished state. So the Jewish people fast. Hey, go fast. Sure, no problem. Fast, your heart's content. Esther fasting is the key point. Yes, Tina.
So the feast that I'm a little bit confused. The feast that we describe in the Megillah, that's the feast in which he repudiates
Vashti.
Vashti.
Yes, before the story happened, the beginning of the story.
So are you saying that the Jews should not have attended the feast, or they should have?
The Jews should have absolutely attended the feast if invited. And the moment that treif was served, I could have taught all the Jews in Shushan a trick. You look up at the waiter and you say, "Thank you very much, I'll pass." And Achashverosh is going to say, "Oh, you don't like royal shrimp?" And the Jew says, "No, I'm sorry, I don't eat shrimp. I'm sorry." With no disrespect to the king.
So, I'm sorry, but this is actually a really important point, because and I'm going to speak of personal experience, but I find that the worst anti-Semitism, to go back to the subject, I mean, the worst anti-Semitism is really the one that you confront when you're not openly Jewish. Meaning, if you are afraid of standing up for your faith, it's almost as if you attract the anti-Semitism. But if someone is basically in your face with Judaism and absolutely non-ashamed to be Jewish, I think people would respect it more because they understand that this is who you are.
I would agree with you for the most part and disagree with you to a certain extent, and I'll qualify that. For the most part, I think you're right. I believe that people who aren't Jewish respect Jews that respect their own Judaism.
That's right.
So I believe in that to a certain extent. I'll also, just for devil's advocate, present the flip side of that coin. I think a lot of what we refer to as ignorant anti-Semitism is specifically experienced by people who are very visibly Jewish. So, if a person wasn't visibly Jewish, I don't think you'd have a child or an adult walk up to them in a grocery store and ask to see their horns, just perpetuating the anti-Semitic myth that Jews have horns, and so on and so forth. So my point is, yes, Jews who respect their own Judaism usually have the ability to rise above a lot of anti-Semitism at the same time. And I'm not saying this is justification for the Jews who ate treif at Achashverosh's feast. Just there is always two sides that we call. But yes, for the most part, I would agree with you. I'll tell you very briefly because we are very short on time. My father always tells the story. My father moved here in 1992. He was granted an audience with a very, very, very prominent businessman that everyone had wanted him to meet. This was someone who was very not Jewish, very pro-Israel, very pro the Jewish community, and people were encouraging my father to meet with this big business leader here in town. My father got a meeting with him, and my father went to meet this man. And they sit down at the meeting. My father had been in town for 6 months. He was flying under the radar, and he sits down with this very prominent Utah businessman. And the businessman says, "Look, Rabbi Zippel, I've heard nice things about you. You seem like a good guy. I'm going to sit, I'm going to schmooze with you. I just want you to know I have no intention of supporting you. And I want you to know that you have deeply, deeply, deeply disappointed me. Okay, wow, I'm sorry. Might I ask how in the short 6 months that I've been here, I've spent most of my time cooped up in my 2-bedroom apartment, how I've managed to disappoint? The guy says, sure. It says about 6 months ago, right when you moved to town, there was an event here in town. And I don't remember the specifics of the event. I'm not sure if my mom is watching and she can have my father chime in. No, she left already. But there was an event in town and there was someone who was notably Jewish at the event. He was openly Jewish. And people knew he was Jewish. And there was an event and there was lunch served. And for lunch, there were shrimp cocktails. So this non-Jewish, pro-Jewish businessman, if that makes any sense, is sitting down by lunch and he's expecting the openly Jewish business individual to politely decline the shrimp cocktail. And that didn't happen. The Jew accepted the shrimp cocktail and ate it with great gusto. And so this business leader tells my father that because of that, my father has somehow disappointed him. Now, I think that a lot of people see the Jewish community like, the rabbi knows all the Jews in town and is responsible for all the Jews in town. It doesn't quite work like that. But Ilana, to your point, this man is probably thinking to himself, God, if I turn down the shrimp cocktail, it's the end of me. People are going to think I'm nuts. And in the meantime, the non-Jews of the room are thinking, oh my God, the Jew is eating the shrimp cocktail. So yes, to your point, it very often does work like that. We are running a little short on time. I want to jump to the end. I want to jump to the end and share with you an event that took place in 1990. Fast forward to thousands of years of Jewishness. When we talk about creating that garment, we talk about creating that illusion that we're somehow doing something whilst knowing full well who actually runs the show, I think there was nobody that really expressed and embodied that idea as well as the Rebbe. The Rebbe was obviously a great Jewish leader who believed and espoused faith and helped Jews connect to their faith. And the Rebbe also regularly had audiences with military leaders and political leaders from across the land of Israel and advised them on policy and security and so on and so forth. And so the Rebbe was really plugged in to the Israeli security scene. In April of 1990, the Rebbe's office got a call from one of the aides of Prime Minister Shamir, who was letting the Rebbe's office know that the PLO in 1990 had issued a bulletin, an email, a tweet to all of their followers, encouraging them to attack Jewish institutions around the world, not just in the Middle East. And so the Prime Minister's office was giving 770 a heads up that here is a pretty prominent Jewish destination in the United States of America. Be aware that the PLO has actually called for acts of violence against Jewish institutions. And so the Rebbe, shortly after this phone call, was headed down to daven the mincha service, the afternoon service in the big synagogue, and one of his secretaries whispered in the Rebbe's ear that this alert had come in, and just kind of a heads up. After the short mincha prayer, the short afternoon prayer, the Rebbe gave a talk to all those assembled, and the Rebbe actually addressed the threat from the PLO. Laura, read for us text 13, please, on page 34.
About an hour ago, I received word that the PLO commanded all of its international chapters to strike, quote, Jewish enemies, close quote, and inflict bodily harm and much more. May it never come to be. We will not elaborate on such negative things. It is therefore necessary to underscore God's abundant blessing to all Jews in all places for all that they need with an attitude of happiness and authentic trust. Special emphasis should be placed on the well-known directive, think good and it will be good. Positive thoughts lead to positive outcomes. It is also appropriate to utilize this information, not to frighten, God forbid, but with happy attitude, thinking positively, to add more in matters of Torah and mitzvot.
For me, one of the most powerful points of this text is the first paragraph. The Rebbe spells out what the threat is. The Rebbe doesn't say, in very vague terms, I want to talk about a threat that's not really credible. Here's what happened. We don't need to run from this. We don't need to hide from this. The PLO has commanded all of its chapters to strike Jewish enemies. This is not a secret. This is not something which we have to somehow sweep under the rug. This is a legitimate reality. Yet, the same paragraphs, we will not elaborate on such negative things. We're not going to stand up here now and bemoan the state of affairs of the international geopolitical scene, and there's a threat that we're going to get killed, and oy vey, this ties into the ADL's most recent study. Look, the threat is real. The threat is credible. Just because the threat is credible does not mean that we need to get bogged down in the mud of worrying and obsessing and hyperventilating over the negativity of this threat. The threat is credible. So what are we going to do about this credible threat? All the right things. We're going to add in Torah study, pray, add in charity. There were also police cars outside 7-7. And yet the Rebbe's attitude was, look, the threat is real. We're aware of the threat. Steps will be taken to combat the threat. What ultimately can we do? All the things that will help us be mindful of the miraculous partnership that we are in. We do our part on the end of the miraculous partnership. To put it in the terms of this class, we think to ourselves, well, we follow these 4 steps, I think, really kind of delineated in the Rebbe's talk. We don't brood in the negative, we reduce the panic, we trust in God, our shepherd, and we take appropriate action. And what we think to ourselves is, what can we do on a regular basis to be more Esther-like? Using Esther as the paradigm of someone who managed that miraculous partnership to a T, of somebody who was aware of the realities of the world she lived in, lobbied the king, took matters into her own hands, but at the same time remained deeply and profoundly mindful of how that partnership worked. That is the approach to take whenever we find ourselves in a situation like this.
Lesson 1, the internal people. 1, worrying creates dejection and ineptitude. To address an issue effectively, we need to reduce the anxiety associated with it. 2, the Jewish people are an internal people. History has shown that despite the pain and suffering that we endured, the Jews and Judaism always survive and thrive. Recognizing this is an important step toward feeling optimistic about our people and about our future. 3, to be realistic means to not lose sight of the fact that we are living in one of the best eras for Jews, and that we should be thankful for that. For the first time in millennia, the vast majority of Jews do not live under regimes that persecute Jews. And in some countries, while individual acts of anti-Semitism have risen, the data also show that fewer people overall harbor anti-Semitic sentiments than previously. 4, the ultimate Jewish institutions means bitachon. We are empowered to ingrain in our minds a trust in Him, feeling that God is going to take care of us, and that He will be with us even when we pass through dark times. In fact, placing our trust in God triggers the opening of channels for additional revealed God. 5, the Torah teaches us that the success of any of our endeavors is God's providence and blessing. Nothing in our lives is a mere product of nature. God instructs us, however, to create a garment through which His blessings can operate in disguise. Hence, we must take all the natural steps, whether to earn a livelihood or to protect ourselves from anti-Semites. But the blessing is entirely God's doing. 6, accordingly, efforts to engage in logical methods of protecting ourselves are inseparable from efforts to secure God's protection. In the Torah story, Queen Esther recognized this, and she therefore prioritized being worthy of God's protection over being attracted to Ahasuerus.
I invite you to join me next week for lesson 2 entitled No Apologies. Next week, we'll be tackling why is there so much anti-Semitism? Are we doing anything wrong? Can we do anything right? No apologies. I think the title of the class might give away some of the direction we're going to be going in. But yes, lesson 2 is entitled No Apologies. I do one housekeeping note. I made travel arrangements before I took on the responsibility of teaching this class. And so next week's class, the only time we'll do this will be on Tuesday. Next week class will be on Tuesday, November 2nd Tuesday, November 2nd at 7 p.m. right here in this very room. For those of you that are on Zoom, we hope you can join us in person at some point. I'm sorry, 7:30, thank you. Yes, Tuesday, November 2nd at 7:30, same time, same place, just different day, and then we will be back to our Monday class schedules. I very much hope you can join me. An email recap will go out tomorrow, as well as a video recording of the class. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Feel free to email or text with any questions.